everybody. I'm Chef AJ, and welcome to Healthy Living. My guest today is Frederic Patenaude. Frederic runs the website www.renegadehealth.com and is the author of the book Raw Food Controversy. So please welcome Frederic Patenaude. How you doing?
Great. How are you? Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. It's such a pleasure meeting you at True North a couple years ago, and I'm very interested in what you're going to tell our listeners because your story in some ways is a little bit similar to mine. You have a lot more experience with the raw food diet. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit who you are and how you got interested in this in the first place.
Yes. Well, I started, I'm 39 years old now, and I've been publishing and writing about health since I was 20. And why? Because, well, simply it just became a passion when I was younger. I discovered the writings of Herbert Shelton and natural hygiene, which is a science that emphasizes fasting and raw food diets, etc. And it just was so fascinating to me at the time that I knew I wanted to be involved in some way. And the first thing I discovered was, well, I discovered vegetarianism, but not for very long. And then I discovered the raw food diet, and I immediately became involved in what was like a raw food movement in California that was starting in California, or that was getting, a trend that was gaining in importance. I worked with David Wolf, who was and still is a promoter of this type of diet. And I became really involved in this field, and I became totally disillusioned with it after a few years as my health declined, and I felt compelled to write about it and start a website and share my insights. But once you start on this on a diet, it becomes like a mindset, and it's very difficult to break it.
Mm-hmm.
So although I was not a raw foodist anymore, I was still thinking like a raw foodist. So this is kind of how things evolved over the years, and I kind of consider myself a health writer who's interested in finding the truth and is open-minded, with some biases, of course. Everybody has them, but over time, I kind of I learned to look beyond the biases and look at what the science truly says. And I think I've made up my mind since on what is the healthiest diet. And it's a long answer, but still, that's kind of a long answer to what should have been a much shorter description of how I got started. But essentially it's been a long path.
Right.
Feels like it.
What do you mean when you say I was still thinking like a raw fooder? I thought that was an interesting statement.
Okay, so when you adopt an ideology, it kind of it stays with you. So, for example, if you think that cooked foods are going to make you sick, and maybe they've made you sick in the past because you were a raw foodist, so every time you ate something cooked, you felt bad, you had indigestion, you felt like crap the next day, you had trouble sleeping, etc. Then you associate eating cooked foods with getting sick. Now, it doesn't matter what kind of cooked food it is. When you're on the raw food diet, you kind of feel like you're on a high, right? Only raw foods can give you that feeling. And if you eat something heavier, even if it's simple like potatoes, you'll feel like your energy has been sucked away from you. But in reality, it's your body's just not used to digesting those foods anymore. You got to retrain your body, just like you would retrain your body to digest food after a fast. You wouldn't go and eat a giant plate of rice and beans, and break your fast with it. You would, ease your way into it. So that's what I meant by thinking like a raw foodist, is that I was still thinking that cooked foods would make me sick, and I was still thinking that I could make this diet work if I worked harder at it. And in fact, you can make it work. I'm not saying you cannot, but it was easier for me to figure out a way out. Easier said than done, because I was still thinking, in my mind, in the back of my mind, I was still thinking maybe it is the ideal diet. So that's what I meant by it.
Yeah. Well, that could be a whole lecture, like that somebody that's very knowledgeable could give. What is the ideal diet? Because, I ask myself all the time, is there one perfect diet for everyone? And I think the one you and I follow is closest to perfect. But, are there people thriving on a raw food diet? Because before you answer that, Frederic, I want to tell you a little bit about the other half of my story, because that I went to the Optimum Health Institute, where I really healed myself through a raw food diet from colon cancer, but their raw food diet was very different than the raw food diet I ended up adopting. So in other words, I followed eating, these very healthy things like sprouts and juices and vegetables without sugar, oil, salt, flour for about 6 months. And I all the cancerous polyps in my colon disappeared. So I know that was the food. But the truth is if I had followed a low-fat McDougall diet, as opposed to what I was eating, healing may have occurred. I mean, there's no way to know. But what happened to me, and you may not know this, is that I couldn't sustain the raw food diet. I did for 2 years, but the problem was, other than the social problems, that it's even harder to be a raw foodist socially than it is to be a low-fat, vegan, was number one, I was always cold. I really didn't sleep very well. But what happened is I ended up going to culinary school for raw food, and the raw food diet taught there was very different than Optimum Health. It was based on very many high-fat foods like olive oil and coconut oil and lots of nuts and seeds and avocado. So it was actually a very heavy diet, to me, even heavier as far as digestion than even eating cooked foods. And things like agave and lots of dried fruit like, dates. And I got fatter on it.
You mentioned a few interesting things. Like on the raw food diet, you've got a problem. And I think John McDougall talks about this, that you need the calories. No matter what diet you're following, you need calories. You can't live on kale and salads because you can't, they're essentially negative calories. Like it probably takes more calories for your body to digest lettuce than you get out of it. So we need a source of calories in our diet. And on a cooked diet, on a healthy cooked diet, those calories would come ideally from starchy foods like beans and grains and potatoes, etc., and other vegetables as well. But on a raw food diet, you don't have starch, cooked starch, so you can only get calories from two sources: fruits or refined sugars that are ideally should not be consumed, and nuts, seeds, avocados, and oils, so all fatty foods. So I think the problem with most raw food diets is that you end up getting most of your calories from nuts, seeds, and avocados.
Yeah.
Even when they tell you should not eat those foods, their diet is unrealistic.
Yeah.
I think the diet of eating sprouts and it sounds great in practice to lose weight, but it's not a diet that you can sustain. So
exactly. Unsustainable is exactly the word I would use, because the people that were very militant in the raw food movement, like they would say, oh, you can't have some cooked broccoli and quinoa, that's horrible, but yet they would be pouring olive oil and agave all over the place, and I'm thinking, like, how can these? Because to me, olive oil and coconut oil are processed foods. They didn't exist in nature. We can't make them in our own kitchen. And one of the arguments that raw fooders would use is, well, that's what our ancestors ate. Well, maybe they ate raw fruits and vegetables, but they didn't eat coconut oil and agave.
Absolutely. I mean, by the way, I think you can make a raw food diet work. And there's, in my opinion, only one true way to make it work is
and how's that?
You have to get most of your calories from fruit.
Wow.
And it's not that difficult, by the way, to achieve, but there are problems that the diet is more difficult to maintain logistically and socially, as you mentioned. For example, logistically, because of the quantity that you need to purchase. I would spend up to $800 a month buying fruit and some greens, but most of that money went to fruit at a local market. For one person, I'm talking, not for a family, just for me.
Wow.
And that's buying cases.
Frederic, that could be rent for some people.
Absolutely, yeah. And because you need the calories. I would buy 6 cases of mangoes for a week for myself. I would buy, and that's when I made the diet work. By the way, that's not the diet that wasn't working. So that logistically, it's a little difficult, right? Because of the quantity, and you need to have. If you run out of ripe bananas, you're screwed essentially.
Right.
You need to get an alternative source of calories. So logistically and socially, well, I don't even need to explain because it's obvious that eating this type of diet is almost impossible to follow in society. You have to eat on your own, and if you travel, you can only eat fruit.
Sure.
So, but are there some advantages to eating this way? Let's say you only eat fruits and vegetables, getting most of your calories from fruit, and ideally a lot of greens as well. Well, I think maybe there are some advantages, but I don't see that as being worth all the trouble for most people. You can get, let's say, 95% of the results from eating just a low-fat plant-based diet that is mostly cooked or half cooked, half raw, however you want to do it. But I don't know. Maybe there are some advantages to some people. I certainly think it's worth trying, as if nothing else has worked. If you feel maybe you need extra energy. Some people get great results because fruits are so easy to digest and so on. You get improvements in mood and energy. A lot of people feel great on this type of diet, but there are problems as well. Even eating this ideal type of raw food diet, there are problems to, like dental problems can occur. Weight gain has been seen in some people that are encouraged by some raw food people or promoters to eat a minimum number of calories a day with no regards to how they're how many calories they actually need. So yes, so it's possible to make it work. It's difficult, and personally, I don't eat raw anymore. I will go through some periods because like I said, I'm still thinking sometimes like a raw food is because of all this fat. So sometimes I'll say, oh, I feel like eating raw food this summer for like 2 weeks, and I'll eat like a raw food diet, 100% raw for 2 weeks, and then I go back to what I normally eat.
Wow. Well, you mentioned that in order to do it successfully, you're talking sort of like what Dr. Doug Graham says, like an 80-10-10 type of diet where 80% of the calories are from carbohydrates, 10% from protein, and 10% from fat, and most is coming from fruit.
Yes, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Right. Well, so here's the thing. So I like fruit. I love fruit. I don't eat sugar anymore. So fruit to me is a treat, and it's dessert. It's almost too sweet sometimes. I don't like it to the degree that I feel like I could eat that many calories in fruit. I find that starch is more satiating. A bowl of steamed quinoa with vegetables or brown rice or a potato, or to me, the sweet potato is like the greatest food in the world. And also they're comfort foods. And also I'm always, even though I live in LA, Frederic, I'm always cold. And when my food's not cooked, I'm even colder.
You mentioned cold and sleep, and I can tell you two things about these two problems. The sleep issue is often the result of going to bed hungry on the raw food diet, because the food has left your body a long time ago, right? It digests so quickly that people are just hungry, and then they're hungry during the night, and that keeps them from sleeping well. So you know how it's recommended to eat, in some diets, it's recommended to eat cooked starchy foods at night and eat protein during the day instead. And some diets recommend that because you tend to fall asleep easier after eating starches than you do after eating nothing, or food that is already that digests so quickly. And there's also more serotonin production after eating like potatoes and high carb foods. But I'm not sure about fruit. So I think that also another problem, if you're still digesting during the night a lot of raw vegetables, you tend to get up very often because you need to go to the bathroom. Because if you drink water, you're going to pee it quickly, right? But if you eat I'm talking about a really huge salad. It does take time to digest, even though it's easy to digest and there's not many calories. You do over time release all that water, so that's one reason to explain the sleep problems on the raw food diet. And then the cold issue, honestly, I don't know. I think maybe it's the food that is cold, but maybe it's something else because I have noticed that a raw food diet lowers um a lot of health markers are significantly lower on a raw food diet. Blood pressure, um, metabolism in general, even though it's not the right word to use, but body temperature and so on. So I think I heard a very interesting lecture. I think it was at the Advanced Study Weekend by McDougall in September. I don't know if you remember that, but in one, I think it was Luigi Fontana who was talking about that. Yeah, so he was talking about people are following diets of caloric restriction, like maybe 30% fewer calories than they need, right? And they have tremendous health advantages, right? But there are side effects like sex hormones are lower, they have lower sex drive, and they probably, I would imagine, have those two problems that you mentioned, feeling cold and sleep is fragmented. So it's sort of like a trade-off. Maybe you'll end up living longer because of your lower body temperature. It's like everything shuts down to preserve the body. My thinking is if you follow this kind of diet, you'll probably live quite a long time, and the odds of developing certain disease like cancer are lower, maybe even lower than on a traditional plant-based diet. But you have to follow it as we've described it, not with oils and a lot of nuts and seeds and so on. But there are huge trade-offs, so they're very difficult to manage. And I think you can get a lot of the same benefits by doing a little bit of intermittent fasting combined with a low-fat cooked diet instead of going all raw. That's what I think nowadays.
Sure. Well, it's funny because some of the raw fooders that were well known, they came out and saying that they felt they were wrong and maybe even caused some harm in saying you must eat 100% raw. And they've come out and said, look, I eat cooked food now, and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, raw foods are kind of not as popular anymore. Raw food diets aren't, and I think it's because people who tried raw food diets are able to maintain it for a while, 100%, and I think has tremendous value in many cases. But to do it for a lifetime, honestly, I don't know many people who have done it.
Yeah, I don't know of any populations that have done it where we could study this. And what's interesting is I'm sure everyone has a different story, what brought them to changing their diet and if they tried a raw food diet. But at least the people I've met, and I haven't met everybody, they weren't coming from a health-promoting, whole food, plant-based, low-fat diet like you and I follow. And they weren't coming from that state of health switching to a raw food diet. They all came from a state of ill health following some version of the standard American diet. And there's no doubt that raw food diet is healthier than the standard American diet, just like you could argue that even the paleo diet is. And so I guess what I'm saying is can you attribute the fact that they got better because it was raw food or because they stopped eating the stuff that caused them harm in the first place? You know what I mean?
I think that's the latter because, we don't have any studies comparing, let's say, low-fat, cooked, oil-free diets to low-fat, raw diets, which are even less popular than regular raw food diets, right? So I don't know, honestly. I would think that it's mostly all the stuff that you removed from the diet, and that also there's a benefit to a raw food diet if you're trying to lose weight is that the foods are, because they're so low in caloric density, you lose weight very quickly on a raw food diet.
Yeah, if you're following a low-fat raw food diet, not if you follow the one
exactly. If you follow a low-fat, or in some people, even if you follow a high-fat raw food diet, just because they can't. I'm not talking about oil and things like that, but just if you think, I'm going to eat raw foods, most people don't know what that means. They don't think they need to eat lots of fruit, and so they're going to eat some fruit, a big salad, and maybe some nuts and seeds if they're just trying to do it intuitively, and they're of course going to drop weight like crazy because they're cutting down their caloric density dramatically. They're eating fewer calories in one day, maybe even too low to be sustainable, right? But also because of something else, that the foods that are cooked yield more calories than foods that are raw. Like the exact same food. So a cooked carrot will be, even though in a lab report you'll say that a cooked or raw carrot is the same number of calories. It's not the same number of calories to the body, because cooking makes the starch available, and in raw foods, a lot of it is lost completely. So you lose weight like crazy. That can be a benefit to people who are trying, or let's say a low-fat raw cooked diet, and they find that they're not losing weight quickly enough. You can add a little extra raw food.
Exactly.
Exactly.
That's what Dr. Goldhammer says, is that you don't have to do the whole thing, but that if you are, that fruits and vegetables are, especially the raw ones, and not that we cook our fruit, are less calorically dense than cooked vegetables, because raw vegetables are about 100 calories a pound. You cook them, they increase to about 200 calories a pound because you remove the water. And that one of the best ways to lose weight, if you're already following an oil-free, whole food, plant-based diet, is to add more raw matter, especially like salads and raw vegetables. And that's a great way to do it.
Also, one thing people can do, and I don't hear that talked about a lot in plant-based circles, is to eat fruit before a meal. Often it's talked about eating fruit as a dessert, and that's true that if you do that, you can kind of pile the fruit on top of your meal and have extra calories that you don't need. But if you eat the fruit, let's say 15, 20 minutes before your meal, your body will get the signal that it's full a lot faster. And there've been studies done on that where they give people orange juice or the entire orange.
Sure.
People who ate the orange before the meal, not after, before the meal, they eat fewer calories in the meal because just intuitively you feel like you're not as hungry.
Interesting. So these very high fruit diets, or even people that are fruitarians, you had mentioned that you have heard of, or maybe known people that have had dental problems. And I believe I either heard or read something by Dr. Furman that he saw the same thing, and even sometimes dental and mental problems. So what's your feeling about this high fruit, and why would it cause dental problems?
Well, it's not something that I heard. It's something that I experienced myself and many others. And in fact, I would say that's probably the biggest problem with the raw food diet. And it's, yes, it's the sugar, right? There's the sugar in the fruit, but it also has to do with caloric density, because when you eat food that are not as caloric dense, you tend to eat more often, right?
Sure.
So you tend to snack. And some people think they're eating, let's say, 2 or 3 meals a day, but they're snacking, having a date here and there, and so on. So it's the body will do that. I mean, it sends you a signal to eat more often, because you can't just eat like 1,000 calories of fruit as easily as you can eat 1,000 calories of, let's say, a normal cooked meal. So people tend to graze, drink coconut water, etc. And every meal is sugary, right? Has fruit sugar, and most people in Western societies have poor dental health to begin with. So we've all experienced cavities. Our mouth, we're building plaque on our teeth, etc. And some people, would say that has to do with just genetically the way our teeth are too crowded, etc. There are many reasons for that, right? So for whatever reason, in the Western world, we tend to develop cavities, and we tend to create a situation in our mouths that is conducive to, when the conditions are right, to the proliferation of more bacteria, more plaque, and everything that comes with that: cavities, gum disease, etc. So it's just kind of a time bomb. Like, we're taking care of our teeth, but the balance is fragile. It's easy to shift it in the wrong direction. So when you put someone on a raw food diet, lots of sugar all at once, lots of acidity in the food, like, fruits have acids in them, lemons, oranges, pineapple, etc. Even things like tomatoes. So acids, sugar, and eating often, I mean, that's like a combination for disaster. Yeah. So also I think because of the fact that a lot of people, as soon as they switch to a raw food diet, they also switch other behaviors, like they'll stop using toothpaste that contains fluoride, and they'll use a natural toothpaste.
Sure.
So now they've lost that extra layer of protection as well. So it's all of those things combined that lead to the dental problems.
Yeah, well, I don't like having dental problems. I'll tell you that. That's one of my least favorite area of my body to experience problems. So let's talk about some of the, well, I don't want to say if they're myths, but I'm not sure they've been proven, but things you hear over and over again from people that are proponents of raw food diets. And one of the things I always heard is you can't cook your food because you destroy all the vitamins or minerals. Fact or fiction?
It's partly fact and partly fiction. The fiction part is all of the word all, right? You destroy some of the vitamins and minerals, but it varies with the food. Minerals mostly you don't destroy them, right? You just lose them in the cooking water. So if you're cooking a soup but you keep all the juices of the soup, you're not losing anything, right? Yeah. If you're baking a potato, you're not losing any of the minerals. But yes, you're destroying some vitamins are heat sensitive, like vitamin C. So if you bake a potato, you're likely destroying a lot of its vitamin C content. But you're also eating other foods that have vitamin C. That have kept their vitamin C. You're eating some fruit, you're eating some salads, etc. So I think having both raw and cooked makes sense, right? But even someone eating 100% cooked, there's so much in the food already that remains unaffected by the cooking process that it's actually enough, right, for our needs.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny because one of my favorite things to put on a potato is salsa, and salsa is raw, and it has the vitamin C intact, and that's like a perfect combination because any vitamin C I lost in the cooking of the potato, now I'm adding extra vitamin C with the salsa.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you know what else I do, and I don't know if you do this too. Some people think I'm crazy, but we do it and we love it. And I just found out, I spoke at a conference at Emory University in Atlanta a few weeks ago, and I found out there's a name for it. But, I steam my kale. I just, I just do not really like the taste of raw kale unless it's got like a high fat, like dressing, like with tahini or avocado or nut butter. So I like to lightly steam my vegetables. And in the pot, it makes like this broth. And I love it, and I drink it, and to me it's delicious, or I save it to make soup. And and people think I'm crazy for drinking it, but there's minerals in that, and they actually have a word for it. They call it pot liquor, and I think it's great.
Yes, I do that too. Or I'll reuse the water in something else, like right after if I prepare. Like today I cooked some vegetables, and initially I cooked the kale, and then there was still some cooking water left, and then I cooked other vegetables, onions, and butternut squash, and I just put them in the same water that evaporated, so all the water was used up.
It's great. So what I hear is our ancestors didn't cook our food, so neither should we. Our ancestors didn't bathe either, so we shouldn't take a bath,
Well, what ancestors? How far back do you want to go? Because I'd like to kind of separate our ancestry into two parts: pre-human ancestors, so before we're officially Homo sapiens, and after, right? So before the Homo sapien, complete, I would say before you encounter a person that you could say this is a person, this is a human, it has this almost exactly the same genetic qualities as a modern human. That's what, maybe 100, 200,000 years ago, according to, depending on the who you're getting this information from. So, but somewhere in there, right? And before that, well, we're kind of entering a very kind of strange place where we don't know exactly, but we know that the human evolution has happened over millions of years, and our pre-human ancestors ate, if you go back far enough, where vegetarians ate what basically modern apes eat or something like that. And this is, this can be seen in our physiology. In our current physiology, we have a body type that is more like a frugivore than a carnivore. So we eat fruits and vegetables, but it's evolved since to adapt to a cooked diet, right? Mm-hmm. So at some point in time, humans started cooking food, and it probably was right along the timeline of becoming Homo sapiens. So I think the argument doesn't quite hold water, but it's true to some extent that, but it's mostly reflected in our, let's say, in our physiology, and explains a lot. For example, why human beings develop heart disease, and carnivores in nature don't. Like, it's impossible to give heart disease to a dog, no matter how much butter you feed the dog, right? They don't develop plaque in their arteries, and humans do. And we never adapted to eating animal food in that way, right? So that's because of this pre-human ancestry of being essentially a fruit eater and a vegetable eater.
Wow. Now, one of the, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Catching Fire by, I believe his name was Rangam. He spoke at one of
the I am.
weekends. And I thought it was a fascinating book, and that all raw food is shitty, because from what I understood, and I read this book many years ago, so I don't remember every detail, but what he said in the book was that, fire has been around a really, really long time. So it's not, we have been cooking our food a very, very long time. And so we've evolved and we've adapted to actually eating these foods, because I know there are raw foodists that say, you should never eat, grains, and you should never eat beans and things like that. But one of the things I found fascinating about his book was that he said that all species, even species that eat raw food, like snakes, because snakes don't cook their food, right? Snakes swallow their prey whole. But when offered, they would prefer the raw food. And I thought that was very interesting.
You mean they would prefer the cooked food?
Right. Excuse me, the cooked food. That's right. So even species that do not eat cooked food, like a snake. Because snakes, they don't have hands, they don't have tools, they don't cook. But when they were studying them, if they offered the snake cooked food over raw food, they would prefer the cooked food, that all species did. And I have a feeling it has to do with survival and caloric density, because it's very difficult to get enough calories from raw food unless you're using high fat foods like oils and nuts and seeds to excess and eating all day.
Well, that's, it's interesting, because the human being can eat twice a day and even once a day. Some people only eat once a day and remain perfectly healthy that way. But animals that eat a raw food diet, that are similar to us, like apes, they have to eat all day, right? They have to eat and digest all day, because the food is, even if you take, let's say, fruits and vegetables from your grocery store, they're not eating those fruits and vegetables, which have been hybridized over time to reflect the human preference for foods that are easy to digest. Fruits in nature are very fibrous. They don't have a lot of sugar compared to modern fruits. So the animals must eat a lot more of those foods. And that's probably why they don't develop the same problems, let's say, that I refer to as, like, say, dental problems. I was in Costa Rica. I lived for a few years in Costa Rica, and there was a sign outside that struck me, and I took a picture of it, and the sign said, "Do not feed bananas to the monkeys," and it listed all the health problems that they would get from eating bananas, and one of them was dental problems. They would actually die from those dental problems, because, of course, dental problems can develop into major bacterial infections and so on, and they don't have dentists, of course, out there in the wild, and they would die from bananas given by tourists, ultimately. And it's crazy, because you'd think a banana is a fruit, right? But it's a fruit that we've developed with modern agricultural techniques. But the fruits that the chimpanzees eat, as was noted in the book Catching Fire, are fruits we would never eat. Humans would find them repulsive, astringent. Think about eating, I don't know, an unripe persimmon. Foods like we would not be able to survive. Our bodies have adapted to diets that are cooked, and I like to say that the raw food diet, the modern raw food diet, is a cooked diet, because instead of cooking food by fire using heat, we process foods in other ways. We use blenders and make smoothies, etc., to get that caloric density. It seems that it's very difficult for people to handle just bare fruits and vegetables without doing some kind of processing as to survive on that diet. And even then, we can only do it with fruits that have been selected over thousands of years to be the sweetest and with the least fiber.
Right. And I notice like a lot of raw food is the dehydrated foods, which when you completely take out the water, you increase the caloric density. And, it seems to be like a lot of snacks, like bars made out of nuts and dates and things like that.
Yeah, that's
Right.
I think it's not as popular as it used to be anymore. My feeling is that the raw food diet is a trend that is dying right now. I mean, that's what I'm kind of seeing. I don't know if I'm right, but I think it was a fad. And if you go back in history, like 150 years, it was a fad that, went in and out of style over time.
Yeah. So one of the things I've heard from militant raw food is that the reason we shouldn't cook our food is because it kills the enzymes, and that we're born with only a certain amount of both digestive and metabolic enzymes, and cooked food will kill these. And Dr. Clapper I've interviewed him twice, and he says that even if that were true, and he doesn't believe it is, he says we have hydrochloric acid in our stomach that kills everything anyway. So how do you feel about this whole talk about raw food and killing the enzymes and all that kind of stuff?
Well, it's an argument that I haven't heard in a long time because it's simply not true. I mean, there's zero evidence for it. The doctor that talked about it was Howell, if I'm not mistaken, and he had a book called The Enzyme Theory or something like that. And there were no references. He referenced another book that he had written that you couldn't get anymore, right? So it's like he was self-referencing himself for his theory, which was completely inaccurate. So, I mean, there's really nothing to say about that because there's absolutely zero information that would prove that in any current science.
Yeah. But that's something that I have heard over and over. You had mentioned that you spend about $800 a week to eat a raw food diet, which again is rent for some people. One of the things I notice is because they're big proponents of juices and smoothies, I don't think smoothies are necessarily unhealthy for some people. I think that for people losing weight, it's better to eat your food. But with juicing, I mean, I would have to spend, to get a glass of juice, I would have to spend like $25 if it was organic. And that produce could have lasted me all week if I were to eat it.
Yeah, I don't juice anymore. Occasionally I'll juice oranges to have a fresh glass of orange juice, but that's like a treat, right? And smoothies, it's the same. I used to live on smoothies, right? And now I mean, I'll make a smoothie like maybe after working out
Sure.
once a week. But even then, if I work out, I don't. I mean, I'm not a professional athlete. Like I don't need some kind of post-workout drink. So most of the information people hear about, how often, how much you need to eat after a workout is just based on the research done on professional athletes and people. Unless you're burning like through 600 calories in a workout, you don't need to worry about that. So so I completely agree with you. Like most people don't need that. And unless you're trying to live on a raw food diet, like if you're trying to live on a 100% raw food diet, then you might run into the problem we mentioned, which is caloric density. And then blending food might help you, and it might also help you assimilate the nutrients in green vegetables because you're not cooking them. So otherwise, if you're not chewing them carefully, you run the risk of just not digesting them fully and not getting enough of those minerals that the body needs, which is not a problem on a diet that includes cooked vegetables.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Now you got into this about 20 years ago. You said you were 21 years old and you started working for David Wolfe, who's a big proponent of the raw food diet. Did you have any weight or health challenges, or how did you even hear about this and got interested in it at such a young age?
Well, it's kind of weird to think about it now because I did not have any health problems. In fact, I created health problems by following the diet. So I was 18 when I decided to go vegetarian, and that was because my mom was interested in it, and I just wanted to learn more about it to make up my own mind because she converted or a household one day to a vegetarian household, and I was kind of rebellious, and I was like, oh, let me figure out if it's true. And then what I found out, because I was going to a music school, right? I was doing my degree in music interpretation and classical guitar and so on. And it was also a school where there was a big agricultural department for studying agricultural studies. And so there was a big library of all those magazines that John Robbins had referred to in his book, A Diet for a New America. So I just wanted to kind of prove him wrong, right? Just pulled out all of these trade magazines from the beef industry, the egg industry, the poultry industry, and what I found was shocking. I mean, everything that John Robbins had said, it was true, like the way they're treating the animals, their distortion of the truth, information, and trying to, just messed up stuff, right? That we now know are true. I mean, it's common knowledge. There's the way they're operating. But at the time, it was kind of shocking for me. So I discovered that. I became a vegetarian. And then I got, everything was going well. I was thinking about going vegan. Like, that was going to be my next step. But then I discovered the raw food diet, and then I felt great initially on the raw food diet because it was a low-fat type of raw food diet. I lost a lot of weight, and then got into the whole gourmet raw food thing and just cooked food is poison. I was very young and impressionable, and I still thought it was the ultimate diet. So I don't know why I followed it. Maybe Doug Lyle could explain to me better than I could figure it out on my own. But then it became more like, a personal interest in figuring out what is actually the ideal diet.
Yeah. Well, what do you think it is? That was going to be one of my later questions, but as long as you brought up those exact words, what do you think the ideal human diet is?
I don't know.
Good.
Like, it depends on what. I think that, in the context of our society and the problems we're dealing with right now, which are problems of overfeeding rather than underfeeding. Our problem is just getting enough nutrients with as few calories as we can, right? To maintain our weight and energy and not cause any disease by not putting anything in our mouth that can cause disease, like too many saturated fat, cholesterol, etc. So I think the ideal diet in this context, right, would be like a plant-based diet, which would include fruits, vegetables, and beans and grains. And I will also include nuts and seeds and avocados in that context, with the caveat that, you can eat them if you're at a healthy weight.
Yes.
And that you need extra calories because you're very active. So that's when you need to eat, more nuts and seeds, I think. Right. And then, and that's it. That would be a completely vegan diet. Whether it's raw or not doesn't really matter in that context that we described. And with some supplementation of B12 and the other standard stuff that your readers are already or listeners are already aware of. And I mean, that's it. But I think we can add a little bit to that, how to improve our health, like water fasting, some intermittent fasting can be very helpful.
Sure.
Exercise, of course, and getting sunshine and so on. But, just a diet it's pretty straightforward. If we were living in a different world where our problem was just getting, not like overcoming periods of famine and so on, maybe the diet would be slightly different. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned nuts, and, I've been accused of bashing nuts. I don't think nuts are unhealthy, and I don't tell people not to eat them. If they're trying to lose weight, I think they should either abstain from them for some of the time or limit them to about an ounce a day. But in your book, Raw Food Controversies, and I don't know if I'm going to say this name right, Mosseri, because it's got like an accent aigu on the top, but you say, in all his books, Mosseri told horrible stories of people who suffered terrible diseases after consuming generous servings of nuts on a regular basis. It has been my experience over the years that the high fat content is only one of the negative aspects of nuts. Can you talk a little bit about what you wrote in the book when you said that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was written a while ago when we talk about eating too many nuts. I'm talking about 5 ounces a day, things
Wow.
like that. So I think if you do that, like is common in certain raw food diets, uh, my belief is that nuts can be acid forming. They're acid forming as opposed to fruits and vegetables, and I don't know if that's what else is going on, but it is true what if you eat that level of nuts, I think it's the fat content, but it's something else about, I don't know, just eating, such a concentration of a food that is already concentrated.
Hmm.
But I don't know if I would stand by that anymore to say that there's something else in nuts that's unhealthy. That was more when I was experiencing problems and seeing other people experience problems eating a raw food diet that contains a lot of nuts. Now, I don't see that as happening in a low-fat plant-based diet. So I think eating, like you said, an ounce of nuts a day or something like that is perfectly fine for a lot of people. So yeah, so that's kind of my current stance on it.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is Dr. Howard Jacobson, who I interviewed on this show, who is the co-author of both Whole and Proteinaholic. I recently visited him in North Carolina, and he grows pretty much all of his own food. And I've never seen a walnut tree before. And, when we see a walnut, we see a 3 pound bag at the store, that's probably roasted and salted or whatever. But, they come in a hard shell, and most people are familiar with the shell. But what I didn't know is that there's another layer. Like, did you know that like in the hard shell, then there's like this like another
Yes, yes,
shell,
yes.
and it's like the size of like almost like a tennis ball. And when he handed it to me, I'm like, what is this? And so when I think about like our, if you argue that we should eat raw food because that's what all our ancestors ate, there's no way our ancestors could have eaten 5 ounces of nuts a day, because each one had to be opened. They didn't, as far as I know, they didn't have tools, at least not the way we have today. Maybe they had a rock. But I mean, let me tell you something, Frederick. I couldn't even open that first layer with my hand to get to the hard shell, which I certainly couldn't open. And so they would have had to spend all day even getting a few nuts. You know what I mean? So anyway, I just think that's kind of interesting, because our nuts also were seasonal. Our ancestors were nomadic, so they weren't just eating gobs and gobs of nuts all day, and they certainly weren't eating coconut oil and agave, because those things were not even in nature, and they're still not in nature now, but certainly not back then.
Well, they're concentrated foods, and I think they're nuts in quantity in sufficient quantities tend to be difficult to digest for some people.
Yeah.
And I think that's common knowledge that dried nuts can be difficult to digest. I mean, you need to chew them very well. You need to eat a reasonable quantity. I've known people eating half a jar of almond butter in
Oh
one
my gosh.
day, you
Yeah.
know, like raw foodists. And it's just insane. Avocados tend to be easier to digest. I like to use those foods just as a condiment, right? Like you have a salad, you have like a couple slices of avocado, not the entire avocado like I used to eat, right?
Right. Well, what's interesting is if you go on the website of the people that actually sell avocados, because you would think that they want you to eat as many avocados as possible, they say that a serving of avocado is 1/5 of an avocado. And most people I know, once they open it, they eat the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny. Now, you actually met a breatharian. I mean, is it possible? I mean, I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical. How
No,
could
I don't think it's possible, but I've met people who have claimed to be breatharians, and I've met people who have given seminars about breatharianism and the concept. I've met some crazy people, right,
right,
in
right.
in this movement, and I agree. I mean, no. I mean, unless proven otherwise,
Yeah.
no. Uh, I don't see that happening.
Because you wonder if you're gonna, it would be interesting if we could, like, get a private investigator to follow them around all day and see if they really were, just sneaking off to McDonald's or something, because I don't see how you could live on just air.
I have lived on air and water for 23 days when I did my long water fast in 2005.
Wow, how
But
is that? What brought you? That's interesting, because I personally never water fasted, although I do work during the holidays at True North, which is a medically supervised therapeutic water-only fasting center. I'm scared to death to do it, but what led you to the decision to fast, and what was that like for you? Because I know they fast people as long as 40 days at True North, but 23 days, that's more than 3 weeks.
Uh, it was quite an adventure. I still practice fasting. The reason I do it is I find this is something that works for me. It's more like a spiritual practice. Like it tends to ground me. It tends to help me sleep better. It just as a stress reduction practice more than anything. That's how I personally like to do it. And I think some form of intermittent fasting has been shown to be linked to higher longevity, maybe work as well as caloric restriction in longevity studies. So, and also the reason I did this long fast is I'd known about fasting forever. Like I'd known about fasting since I was reading those vegetarian books when I was 18. So, and I'd never done a long fast. I'd done a lot of short fasts, like 3 days, 1 day, etc. But not like a long fast. So I thought this is something I needed to try at least once in my life. So I did it, and it was difficult. You know, a long fast is difficult. But keep in mind, I mean, I was a skinny raw foodist when I started.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was 139 pounds at almost 5'11" when I started the fast, and now my normal weight, you know, is 155, 160 in that range. But so I started at a weight that was like, you know, like 20 pounds less than I weigh today to start with. So that's probably, I think the people that I saw fasting that had a lot of weight to lose were having an easier time.
This just blows my mind that somebody that was already slender and very slender, that had no health problems, would fast, because at True North, usually the people that are fasting have some kind of health problem and or are overweight, and but to do it willingly, you know, it's almost crazy to me, because it's
well,
you know?
It's not that I did not have health problems, in the sense that there was this, I had this sense that my health was, and especially my energy levels from all these years of raw foods and just wrong dieting and so on. I felt like I just, you know what, I felt like there's something missing, right? I was doing something wrong, and I wanted to get back on the right track of eating the diet that we described. That was when I was still believing that the raw food diet was the ideal diet, that I should follow it 100%. And I knew that the diet that Dr. Graham was recommending, a 80-10-10 type of diet of fruits, vegetables only, but mainly getting calories from fruits, was probably the better way to go. And I felt that the fasting would help me get there to that diet, to eating that diet. So I did the fast, and it did help me. What it did for me was a tremendous boost, like a reset button in my life. It was like, I remember the years after my fast, I was like on fire, like in terms of my productivity and just my ideas. But it was not like instantaneous, but it's more like I gained a lot of clarity about what I wanted to do. And so this is why, like, I'm going to be 40 next year, right? So I decided I'm going to do a little fast before my 40th birthday. So that's why in February of 2016, so in just 2 months, I'll be fasting for like 5 to 7 days. I never fast for longer anymore. At True North. And just as, you know, it's a practice that I like. Maybe every 2 years I'll do a 7-day fast or
No,
5
I mean,
day
hey,
fast.
a lot of people do it there. They're not everybody there has health challenges, but like you say, there's spiritual components, and a lot of people, they just get clarity, and they people love it, and they seem to do it every year, sometimes around their birthday or the holidays. So I get it. I'm scared. I'm going to just tell you, I'm scared. I've gone up to 40 hours without eating, and I've been fine, but I think the thought of doing it actually scares me more than doing it. Now that I'm slender, especially, it's like, oh God, you know.
Well, maybe you should not do it, because, you know, fasting doesn't make eating easier. Like when you break a fast, the most challenging part of fasting is breaking the fast.
Yeah.
Because you want to eat a lot of food, right? And you're obsessed with food, right? So it's not for everybody. I think that the way you're doing it, let's say at a resort like or a health center like True North is the right way to do it because they'll reintroduce the foods in the proper order, starting with juices and fruit and so on. But it is still a challenge, and you tend to think a lot about food during your fast, right? So for someone, let's say your lifelong problem was like you mentioned food addiction and things like that. I don't know if you need to fast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it might make it worse. It's funny that you mentioned that people are hungry, and I guess for some people it goes away. But I remember the first time I was there, my roommate, all he did was watch the Food Network obsessively, and I'm like, you got to be kidding! You're torturing yourself. What's interesting is because when I work there, I often have to deliver the food to the patients' rooms at the holiday season when the kitchen staff is given the day off for the holidays, and I'll never forget this woman named Christina. She fasts there every year. She was formerly very obese, and she's this lovely, slender woman now. So that's her ritual. And one of the first things that people eat when they're refeeding is steamed zucchini. Now, even though I eat lots of fruits and vegetables now, when I used to eat none, I never liked zucchini. I thought of it as sort of like the bastard child. It's like, ugh, zucchini. Like, who would eat zucchini? Right? It's not as exciting or interesting as kale or broccoli, but that's what they would eat. And so I remember delivering her this tray, and you deliver it on a tray, and then there's like one of those metal restaurant things over it. So you hand it to the person. And because I knew her, she said, well, why don't you sit down and talk to me for a minute? It was my last delivery. And I'm like, okay, sure. And this was like the first solid food she'd eaten, because I think they break your fast on maybe juices and broths first. So she opened it up. And I swear it was like watching the movie When Harry Met Sally, when Meg Ryan's character was faking an orgasm in the restaurant and the other lady said, I'll have what she's having. When she ate this steamed zucchini, I thought that she was going to just start crying. She ate it the way that people would eat like a hot fudge sundae. And I couldn't believe it. And what I was seeing was neuroadaptation, because when you fast, even healthy foods, like with no sugar, oil, salt, taste that good. And I remember going down to the kitchen, and the orders were done, and I went and I sliced some zucchini to cook it, and Dr. Goldhammer says, what are you doing? We're done. I said, I don't know. I got to eat some zucchini, and now I just love it. I love zucchini. So it's very interesting how you see that happening, how that when people fast, and one of the reasons people do fast with food addiction is because it does make healthy food taste really good when you're done.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. Like you mentioned, I don't remember eating zucchini after a fast. Maybe I did. I always look forward to the first sip of juice. It's like, oh my God, this is
must be like manna from heaven. So are you in touch with any of the people from your raw food days, or do they kind of see you as like, well, you have renegade health, like, like you left the cult and so now they don't want to talk to you anymore?
Well, a lot of us have done the same thing, like, like a more rational approach, or some people still follow like a raw food diet during the day, or they say they do that. Who knows what's actually going on behind the scenes? But yeah, some people have, didn't like, let's say, what I had to say about the whole movement in my book, Raw Food Controversies. I kind of openly discussed it. And yeah, but overall, I think especially my readers were enjoyed the honesty. Instead of claiming that raw food diet is the way to go for everybody, I openly came out as well. I'm not following it anymore. And but that being said, I mean, I still think there's something to the raw diet that can be useful in many circumstances, like fasting and so on. Maybe as a cleanse. Maybe some people can truly benefit from it for a lifetime. Who knows?
Yeah, and I think it depends where you live, don't you, Frederic? Because if you're living in Costa Rica, where like you literally can pull a banana off a tree, it might be different than if you're living in Anchorage, Alaska, and it's below zero, and you really can't even get those kind of foods necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people are doing it for the wrong reasons. Like let's say, you're trying to overcome a particular health problem, let's say autoimmune diseases. Well, the raw food diet eliminates almost everything that could cause inflammation, right?
Sure.
Like So who knows what exactly you eliminated that was causing the problem? Like we know animal foods and so on, but maybe some people might be sensitive to gluten, or some people might be sensitive to other foods. And of course, when you eliminate all of it, like you're going to get better. Just like when you fast, your body has a chance to heal itself. You're not putting any food in your body that could cause the problem. And there are other things going on during the fast, of course. But so that's probably why the raw food diet works really well for some time for some people, because it's a very restrictive diet.
Great. So now that you've found what works for you, if you could share a little bit with our listeners, like what would you eat in a day, and do you exercise, and how do you feel?
Yes, well, I've done a lot of changes in my diet over the years. So at the moment, what I'm doing is kind of a combination, a summary of all of those things, right? So I'm doing, let's say, I'm trying to eat when I'm hungry, right? So that leads me to not having breakfast like almost every day, because
yeah, we're like two peas in a pod. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
I just feel like to distinguish between true hunger and false hunger is part of the equation, and I'm just not hungry in the morning, so I don't eat. Like I don't feel like compelled to eat in the morning anymore. So, but sometimes I will. If I'm really hungry, I will, right? So my first meal of the day, like for example today, I had potatoes, kale, lentils, and butternut squash. And that was my meal, and there was no fat in the meal, right? No added fat, but sometimes I could add a little bit of tahini on top or a little bit of avocado. And then I might have like 3 or 4 hours later, I might have some fruit, and then that's like my snack or something. And then my dinner will be similar to what I described, right? Yeah. Something like that, right? So that's kind of my pattern. And I try to, I just try to follow my hunger, and sometimes I fast for the whole day. I must say, over the last few months, I've been experimenting with intermittent fasting. That's kind of new. I knew in the last few years that I've been doing it. One problem that I have is insomnia that I've developed over the last couple of years, maybe psychologically caused by lots of changes in my life, right? So I find that fasting really helps me relax, right? It helps me. If I fast for the whole day, I feel like all my troubles are gone. Like I feel completely relaxed, completely at ease, complete peace in my body, right? And then I can sleep better. And then the effects last for many, many, many days, right? For like at least half the week, right? If I do one 24-hour or 36-hour period of fasting. So I've learned to eat enough so I'm not hungry also. That's another important thing. Like I've learned if I eat one meal, like I'm going to pile the food, right, until I'm not hungry. And if I'm still hungry, I'm going to eat more. I'm not trying to count weight or quantities, or I don't worry about any of it, right? And and then that's pretty much what I eat. So it's not that raw anymore, right? But it is. It doesn't matter, because that's not the raw food that gives you the results. At least it's not what gives me the results. It's this combination of eating the diet that has no added oil. I love eating fruit, and sometimes I'll eat fruit as a meal, but it just depends on how I feel, right?
Sure. Well, and you had mentioned intermittent fasting, and if the listeners want to find out more about it, there's a great article on the True North Health website, and I've also interviewed Dr. Jennifer Morano, who talks about it. Are you a big exercise buff, or?
Oh yes, you mentioned exercise. I'm not a huge exercise buff, but it's something that I motivate myself to do, right? So I go to the gym 3 times a week, and I do this little routine, and sometimes the routine emphasizes weightlifting, and sometimes it emphasizes cardio exercise, and the rest of the time I just walk a lot, right? So that's kind of what I'm doing. I know I could do more, like a lot of people are thinking, yes, I could exercise more. So I'm trying to do like the minimum, right? And then if I can do more, that's even better, right? So that's I'm not perfect, but that's what I'm trying to. do something that's realistic, right? If I say I'm going to go to the gym every day or exercise for 1 hour every morning, I'm going to do it for 1 or 2 weeks and then give it up. So I'm trying to do an exercise program that I know I can follow.
Yeah, terrific. Well, here's my last question. I ask this almost everybody I interview. Who in your life has inspired you the most? It doesn't have to be somebody in the plant-based world. It could be anybody.
Wow. That's a very good question. Um, I would say Ludwig van Beethoven.
Well, you know what's
Yeah,
interesting about him is he was deaf, right?
he was progressively deaf. That's what's even worse than going deaf overnight, because if you go deaf overnight, you can, you realize, okay, now I'm deaf, what do I do? But if you're like progressively going deaf and you're a composer and you're a pianist and you're a virtuoso, I mean, like every day you worry about it.
Wow.
And he reinvented himself 3 times in his life. So if you listen to his music, there are 3 periods of his life. And the middle period, he almost killed himself, because he realized he was going deaf and his life was going to be over. And that led to incredible music, of course, because he decided, I'm going to take the heroic path. I'm going to overcome my problems. And then when he reached the period of his life when he was totally deaf, he composed his most spiritual music. So it's almost like he found something beyond the music. To me, that's very inspirational, because you can apply that to any other challenge that someone could face.
Wow. Well, is it true though that even when he was deaf, he was still able to compose symphonies?
Absolutely. He
Yeah.
composed this, yes.
And that might have been some of his best work. See, that's interesting because, as you know, I don't eat nuts anymore, and I was recently asked to create a pecan pie. And I did it without ever tasting it, and I hit it out of the ballpark. And I said, well, and they said, how could you do it if you couldn't taste it? I said, well, Beethoven, if he can compose symphonies deaf, I think I can do this. So
That's a good answer.
well, it's just been such a pleasure talking to you. Your book, Raw Food Controversies, is really inspirational and enlightening, and thank you for putting that information out there, because maybe your journey will help someone else before they, go down the wrong path with dietary change. And how can people get your book, Raw Food Controversies?
Well, the best way is to get it on Amazon, so it's widely available on Amazon.
And tell us a little bit about your website, renegadehealth.com, and what people can, if they want to get in touch with you, or do they sign up to be?
I didn't start Renegade Health. This is a website started by Kevin Gianni, and I took it over 2 years ago as a great platform to reach a lot of people, because we now reach over 100,000 people in our email follow-up and email newsletter. And I'm writing articles on health pretty much every week, trying to summarize the latest things that I think are useful for people to know.
Wow. Well, thank you for what you do, and I hope to see you at either True North or one of the McDougall weekends in the future. It's just been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks all of you for listening to Healthy Living. I'm Chef AJ, and I make healthy taste delicious.